Hello, my name is Deshauna Dickens, and I'll be presenting my health policy analysis on oral anti-cancer medication parity. This will be an overview of my discussion today. I'll discuss the problem, background, landscape discussion, policy options, recommendations, and a brief conclusion. The problem statement for this health policy analysis is: how can North Carolina help reduce the financial burden to cancer patients associated with the costs related to oral anti-cancer medications? Just a little background to get us started. According to the American Society of Clinical Oncology in the United States, in 2016, there were approximately 1.7 million new diagnoses and over 595,000 deaths attributed to cancer. Cancer is the leading cause of death in nearly half of the states in America, although overall it's the second leading cause of death in the U.S. At the rate it currently is, it is expected to surpass heart disease as the leading cause of death in the U.S. by 2020. North Carolina is unfortunately one of the states where cancer is the leading cause of death, with a projected incidence for 2018 of over 60,000 new diagnoses and projected mortality to reach as high as 21,000. Rising costs of healthcare and of anti-cancer medications is contributing to the overburdened healthcare system, as well as adding increased stress on patients suffering from cancer as well as their families. Traditionally, IV chemotherapy was the primary method for treating cancer. However, in recent years, many of the first-line treatments, and in some instances the only treatment for certain cancers, are oral pill forms of anti-cancer medications. Oral treatments for cancer have become increasingly available as an option for patients, with greater than 50 new FDA-approved medications being released in recent years, and more forthcoming down the clinical trials pipeline. While oral anti-cancer medications are more convenient for patients, financial challenges exist that can create barriers for patients to access these medications, including high costs and insurance parity when compared with their injectable IV chemotherapy counterparts. To complicate access even further, many oral anti-cancer medications are often covered under outdated insurance coverage policies, where IV chemotherapy medications are covered under an individual's medical benefit component of their insurance, and oral anti-cancer medications are covered under the prescription drug benefit. This differentiation is important because patients may be subject to cost-sharing out-of-pocket costs, including coinsurance and deductibles. This type of cost sharing can have huge financial implications for patients who do not have an IV or injectable alternative, including not starting, or even delaying treatment due to the inability to afford other basic needs. The good news is that, in an effort to remove this barrier to life-saving cancer treatments, 43 states plus the District of Columbia have implemented laws that require health plans currently covering cancer treatment to provide more equitable out-of-pocket costs between IV anti-cancer medications and oral anti-cancer medications, or in other words, parity. Unfortunately, in North Carolina, there is no current legislation that exists to address oral anti-cancer medication parity. North Carolinians are still being forced to choose between the best cancer treatment possible and treatments they can afford. However, that seems to be changing. As of April 2017, the North Carolina General Assembly took the first step at passing legislation that would make North Carolina the 44th state to address oral anti-cancer medication parity with the Cancer Treatment Fairness Act, or House Bill 206. This legislation passed by a vote of 90 to 22 and was forwarded to the North Carolina Senate, where unfortunately it has sat for over the past year. Opponents against the oral anti-cancer medication parity legislation noted in the literature are those groups who suggest that parity will increase overall health spending. Also, there have been concerns that oral parity legislation will lead to increased insurance premiums. A few studies in the literature have conducted analysis that show that while parity may increase premiums only slightly, these analyses fail to account for rising drug prices and therefore may underestimate the true premium cost increases. Others suggest or argue that state laws don't help everyone. This may be true, as state parity laws are unfortunately limited due to the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. This is a federal law that exempts certain health plans from state laws, thus limiting states in their power to create significant change in relation to parity and allowing the potential that gaps in coverage will continue to persist. One of the good things about this, though, is that currently there is a legislation that was in the House, or House Bill 1409, the Cancer Drug Parity Act, which is attempting at the federal level to pass legislation for parity between intravenous as well as oral medications and closing some of these loopholes that would be a supplement to any state law that is passed. In terms of the Affordable Care Act, or ACA, the legislation, when passed, did not mandate drug parity in oncology. However, it did contain provisions that may impact oral chemotherapy. For example, out-of-pocket limits, closing the donut hole by 2020, and essential benefits. Although essential benefits do require prescription drug coverage, the law makes no specific mandate, again, for drug parity in oncology. Lastly, drug parity laws are not designed to lower the price of high-cost cancer drugs. So, unfortunately, there would be additional policy that would be necessary to support any laws enacted at the local as well as state and federal level due to the skyrocketing costs of prescriptions. So, what are the options for this health policy? Option number one would be to mandate that insurance companies pay costs of oral anti-cancer medications at the same cost-sharing levels as IV or injectable medications. The pros of this particular option would include improving quality of life for cancer patients, providing greater access to life-saving treatment, and updating outdated policies to catch up with the science. While orally administered anti-cancer medications are not without side effects, equal access to these drugs can alleviate suffering and improve outcomes for many cancer patients. Additionally, drug coverage is a top concern for cancer patients, not just the uninsured, but even patients with good or adequate insurance. Both are subject to have to make decisions to choose treatment versus not if their out-of-pocket expenses create a barrier. The cons of this particular option would be insurance mandates may face strong opposition from insurance industry. This particular option does not address the needs of those patients in self-funded ERISA plans. As indicated earlier, those health plans that are protected under the ERISA plans are not subject to state legislation. To affect those individuals in these plans, federal legislation would need to be passed, and currently There is legislation in the Congress, House of Representatives, House Bill 1409, the Cancer Drug Parity Act, that will attempt to ensure that every cancer patient has access to anti-cancer treatments recommended by their physicians. Similar to the North Carolina General Assembly, this legislation was presented a little over a year ago and unfortunately has still been sitting in the Senate without any activity or action. Lastly, a con of this particular option would be that it's not broad enough solution. As indicated earlier, parity legislation does not address the cost of anti-cancer medications, and so therefore legislation or policies or changes to the skyrocketing costs of medications will be important to implement in order to help support this particular option. Option number 2 would include maximum allowed cost sharing or oral anti-cancer medication prescription caps. The pros of this particular option include setting monthly out-of-pocket limits for oral anti-cancer medications. For example, some states do not offer full parity, but rather a maximum allowed cost sharing for a 30-day supply of an oral anti-cancer medication. This maximum amount could vary anywhere from $50 to $300. Another pro of this option is that it would not require a mandate that the insurance company would be held accountable for. A con of this option is that some states actually allow this maximum amount to increase annually based upon inflation. In the long term, that could provide to be cost prohibitive for some patients in that as time increases, their out-of-pocket maximum increases as well. Finally, option 3 would be a combination of both a parity legislation and a maximum out-of-pocket cap legislation. The pros of this legislation would be similar to option 1 in that it would help to improve the quality of life for patients, provide greater access to life-saving treatments, and updating outdated insurance policies to catch up with the science. However, it would go a step further in that it would protect patients from financial toxicities related to cancer treatment by capping their out-of-pocket expenses. A con of this particular option would be a combination of option 1 and option 2. In that insurance mandates may face strong opposition from the insurance industries, it doesn't address the needs of those patients in ERISA plans, and it's not a broad enough solution. As well as with option 2, it doesn't prohibit the legislation from states from allowing the out-of-pocket maximums to increase with inflation. So what is the final recommendation? Option number 3, a multi-pronged approach that will support cost effectiveness and quality care is needed. Oral anti-cancer medication parity alone will not address the issue of financial toxicity and costs of cancer treatment. In the setting where oral anti-cancer medications will become more of the norm than not, it will be important that health policies and legislation are implemented that will support the quality of life for North Carolina residents in the long term. Skyrocketing prescription costs creates barriers to treatment. It is therefore recommended that a combination of both the oral anti-cancer medication parity legislation and maximum allowed prescription caps be implemented to make cancer treatments more affordable and accessible to patients who need them. So in conclusion, it's important to recognize that the number of oral anti-cancer medications are increasing. The number of cancer patients are rising. More patients are surviving, so therefore the duration of treatment for advanced disease is lengthening, and the cost of oncology drugs will continue to soar. It's thus imperative that we come up with creative and innovative ideas for administering high quality and affordable cancer care for patients regardless of the route of administration. Drug parity laws alone fall short by being limited in scope and failing to address underlying problems related to the total cost of cancer care. Another barrier to implementing policy are political priorities. As noted in this presentation, at the local level, North Carolina Senate Bill 152, as well as the federal level, House Representatives Bill 1409, both policies are waiting to be passed, and yet they are sitting there and nothing is happening. It's therefore important as DNP graduates, as well as advocates for our patients, that we speak to our political leaders and encourage them to move on legislation that would be important for our patients.